Welcome to Kilkenny, an Irish city famous for its medieval charm, its castle, and its vibrant culture. Located about 73 miles southwest of Ireland's capital city of Dublin and 30 miles north of the old Viking settlement of Waterford, it lies midway between Dublin and Cork. But to truly understand Kilkenny, we need to journey back over 1,500 years to its origins on the banks of the River Nore, where it lay at an important fording place, surrounded by a fertile agricultural hinterland. Welcome to Storyteller's Hearth Fireside Tales production of The Irish Inquisition, a 14th century tale of crime and punishment. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more fireside stories. Warning: in the interests of historical accuracy, this video contains adult subject matter that some people may consider crude and is not suitable for children and young people under 25 years old or people easily triggered. Long before it developed into a city, this area served as the heart of the ancient Irish kingdom of Ossory, a territory of strategic value which was bounded by the rivers Nore, Barrow and Suir. These waterways functioned as the ancient equivalent of motorways, linking the local population to commerce and cultural influences from as far away as Roman Britain and continental Europe. Furthermore, Ossory was situated on the Way of the Assemblies, one of Ireland's 5 ancient principal arterial north-south pathways, and on a major east-west route that provided connections with the influential early 7th century monastic establishment at Leighlin and to Dublin. However, these conduits of trade and ideas also served as convenient pathways for invaders who were lured to the area by its rich soil and temperate maritime climate. By the 6th century, the area had become thoroughly Christianized by such notables as St. Patrick and St. Kieran, and a major ecclesiastical settlement with its round tower was founded in the 6th century by the travelling monk from Ulster named St. Canice, also known as St. Kenny, giving the medieval church and surrounding community its name. This monastery grew into a powerful centre of faith and learning, attracting scholars and shaping the region for centuries. Another, even earlier structure was the important 5th century Christian church called Donamore, which had, according to strong local tradition, been established by St. Patrick himself. This ecclesiastical building, which later became famous as a house of relics, was located just south of Kilkenny Castle in what became the parish of St. Patrick's. St. Canice's church was elevated to cathedral status in the year 1111. About the same time, the Celtic king of Ossory built a wooden residence at the site where Kilkenny Castle stands today, in which he held court, turning Kilkenny, together with its religious establishments, into one of the more important Celtic administrative and ecclesiastical centres in the region. A pivotal transformation in Irish history began in 1169 under the reign of Henry II. As Norman forces, spearheaded by the ambitious nobleman Sir Richard de Clare, 2nd Earl of Pembroke, made their first incursions into Ireland. Known to history by his enduring epithet Strongbow, de Clare seized an opportunity to expand his power by answering a plea for aid from the exiled King of Leinster, Dermot MacMurrough. Strongbow seized the occasion, with the vague, if not reluctant, approval from Henry II on MacMurrough's promise of land if successful. After marrying MacMurrough's daughter Aoife to cement his claim and securing a decisive victory at the Siege of Dublin in 1171 against the Norse Gaelic king of Dublin, Mac Ragnall, Strongbow emerged as the de facto ruler of Leinster. He swiftly consolidated his gains, absorbing the neighbouring kingdom of Ossory into his expanding lordship. Determined to solidify his dominance, Strongbow erected a motte and bailey castle at Kilkenny in 1172, strategically positioned to control the vital crossing point on the River Nore. This fortress not only anchored Norman authority in the region, but also reshaped Kilkenny's trajectory, transforming it from a Gaelic religious and administrative centre into the linchpin of Anglo-Norman power in Ireland. Thus, in just 3 years, Strongbow's calculated alliances, military prowess, and shrewd territorial control irrevocably altered the island's political landscape. The death of Strongbow's young son, Gilbert, in 1189, leaving the Liberty without an heir, marked a turning point. His vast estates, including the lordship of Leinster, passed to his sister Isabel de Clare, whose marriage to the legendary knight Sir William Marshal fused martial prowess with dynastic ambition. Renowned even in his lifetime as the greatest knight that ever lived for his unparalleled chivalric exploits and political acumen, Marshal inherited not just land but a legacy. By 1199, his loyalty had become indispensable to King John, who formally revived the earldom of Pembroke to secure Marshal's allegiance, elevating him as the first Earl of a redefined Pembroke title. 16 years later, Marshal became a key negotiator with King John and was one of the signatories of the Magna Carta. It was under Marshal's visionary leadership that Kilkenny's strategic importance was cemented. Between 1192 and 1207, he transformed Strongbow's rudimentary motte and bailey fortification into a formidable stone fortress, its iconic drum towers and sprawling curtain walls symbolizing Norman permanence. This castle, still looming over the Nore Valley today, became the administrative heart of the Marshal-dominated Liberty of Leinster, rivaling Dublin in economic clout. Yet, while Kilkenny thrived as a regional power hub, Dublin retained its primacy as the Crown's unchallenged capital, a duality that underscored Ireland's complex Anglo-Norman hierarchy. Flowing eastward into the River Nore, the Brega River formed a natural divide between Kilkenny's ancient Celtic community and the burgeoning Norman settlement nestled within the castle's fortified walls. This physical and cultural separation gave rise to Kilkenny's iconic double towns: Irish Town, the older Gaelic enclave, and High Town, the walled Norman borough that emerged at the foot of the castle. In 1207, William Marshal, as part of his efforts to consolidate Norman control, formalized Hightown's status as a medieval borough by granting it a charter, giving its inhabitants certain rights and officially integrating them into the Liberty of Leinster. Populated by Norman, Flemish, and English merchants and artisans, the town thrived under feudal governance, its residents paying rents to the Earl's administrators in the castle. To cement Hightown's identity, Marshal established St. Mary's Parish, carved from portions of the existing St. Canice's and St. Patrick's parishes. Originally built as the castle's private chapel, St. Mary's evolved into the spiritual and social hub for Kilkenny's elite, its soaring architecture mirroring the ambitions of its wealthy patrons. The Marshal dynasty's male line abruptly ended in 1245 with the death of William Marshal's fourth son, Walter Marshal, 5th Earl of Pembroke, followed by his brothers, Anselm Marshal's demise almost immediately after, triggering a seismic shift in power. The Marshal estates were divided between the 5 daughters of William Marshal the Elder and Walter's widow, Margaret de Quincy, who received a dower's 1/3 of his lands. In this way, the Marshal lands were absorbed by 5 different influential Anglo-Norman families. Through his marriage to Isabel Marshal's granddaughter, Isabel of Cornwall, Gilbert de Clare, a scion of England's mighty de Clare family, inherited Kilkenny Castle and a share of what remained of Marshal's other estates in 1269. This marked the de Clares' formal entry into Ireland, setting the stage for their later clashes with Gaelic lords and rival Anglo-Norman dynasties. The original Irish settlement around St. Canice's Cathedral was known as Irish Town, a separate entity that maintained its distinct Irish character and answered to the Bishop of Ossory. Here the inhabitants tended to be peasant-class Irish natives, who after the Norman conquest were excluded from Hightown and paid rent to their feudal overlord, the bishop. While technically considered free men who could trade, the inhabitants of Irish Town were not permitted to join the powerful merchant guilds, limiting their activities to smaller-scale local trade or certain crafts. While the Irish inhabitants were subject to English law, the courts often deprived them of its full protections, especially if it involved action against an English citizen. Also living in Irish Town were lower-class foreign servants and labourers. The local inns serviced travellers who were often pilgrims to the religious houses, new settlers, and the surrounding farming community that grew cereal grains and raised cattle, sheep, pigs, and poultry. Hunting waterfowl and fishing were also important sources of protein. Since cooking meals was not widespread among the working classes, there likely would have been small bakeries and pie makers to provide the townspeople with fast food. Wool processing, malting barley, and private brewing had become important local industries by the 13th century. There appears to have been one or two flour mills, and at least one forge in the town by the 14th century. The bishop's palace was located beside St. Canice's Cathedral, which was a Gothic replacement of the former Romanesque church. St. Canice's grew to become the largest, most important church in the diocese, and the bishop demanded all the dignitaries of the surrounding parishes attend his cathedral on major feast days. For centuries, these two towns existed side by side, separated by the Brega River, which seasonally became a roaring torrent that served as a constant reminder of the divide between the new Norman rulers and the older Gaelic world. As the population of Irish Town grew, it began to become known by its Gaelic name, which translated as Newtown. Newtown remained unwalled until the late medieval period. The Liberty of Leinster, originally granted to the Marshal family as a semi-autonomous buffer zone between the Anglo-Norman administration in Dublin and Gaelic Irish territories, faced increasing royal scrutiny as the Crown sought to prevent the increasingly powerful regional magnates from rivaling its authority. After the Marshal male line died out in 1245, the liberty passed to Gilbert de Clare, known as the Red Earl, through his marriage to Isabel Marshal. By 1300, the Crown had revoked many of the liberty's privileges, redirecting much of its judicial and fiscal authority to royal officials in Dublin. Nevertheless, Kilkenny remained the cultural and economic heart of the liberty, with its castle serving as the de Clares' administrative seat. But the untimely death of Gilbert de Clare's son at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 triggered a dynastic collapse. With no male heir, the liberty was divided among Gilbert's three daughters, Eleanor, Margaret, and Elizabeth de Clare, in a process termed as the fragmentation, destabilizing the liberty. Eleanor's husband, the immensely unpopular Hugh le Despencer the Younger, referred to as Edward II's favourite, exploited his wife's claim to seize control of the liberty of Kilkenny. Despencer, however, was an absentee lord, focused more on accumulating power in England and Wales, leaving the liberty to his deputies, who seemed more interested in extracting revenues than in governance. Despencer's death in 1326 during Edward II's overthrow led to the Crown to confiscating his Irish estates, including Kilkenny. While Elizabeth de Clare regained limited dower rights, the lack of a clear heir left the lordship in legal limbo, exacerbating regional instability. However, the Crown's direct intervention post-1326 proved ineffective as the royal administrators in Dublin struggled to govern Leinster, creating a vacuum the butlers, as rising Anglo Irish magnates from Tipperary, were only too willing to fill. By the mid-14th century, the butlers had made themselves the de facto lords of the fragmented Marshal inheritance, though formal control of the Liberty's remnants would not be ratified until much later in 1391. In the 14th century, Ireland was still a backwater of English influence, where the Hiberno-Normans of Kilkenny had become used to acting independently of both the Crown and their Liberty overlords, like Hugh Despenser, who were too caught up in England's affairs to bother much about Leinster. To better understand the nuances of our story, we need to give an overview of the legal systems in force in Kilkenny during this time period. A liberty was a franchise granted by the English Crown, giving its lord powers typically reserved for the king, and the Liberty of Leinster had, under the Marshals, become one of the most powerful in Ireland. This jurisdictional independence, known as jura regalia, or royal rights, meant the liberty originally operated under its own legal system, called the Law of the Liberty. This was a modified version of English common law that gave protection to people of English and Norman descent, and those prominent Irish families who had become more English than the English themselves by adopting English names and customs. This law featured, firstly, standardized written orders called royal writs, which were warrants to initiate legal actions. Secondly, the principle that past court decisions created a precedent for future rulings. Thirdly, the court appointed local juries to investigate crimes and decide on cases. And fourthly, the liberty courts were authorized to handle all cases, including capital crimes like murder or rape, without needing to defer to the royal courts in Dublin. The Lord of the Liberty, who was rarely ever in Ireland, governed his liberty through his chief official, the seneschal, who was responsible for the entire liberty's governance. The seat of the seneschal's court for the Leinster liberty was Kilkenny Castle, from where he collected all revenues, like taxes and fines, for the liberty. His authority within the liberty was almost absolute, only needing to defer to the Justiciar of Ireland. Otherwise, in theory, he answered directly only to the Lord's Deputy in Dublin, who often took little interest in mundane affairs, and not to any other civic or church officials in or outside his district. The day-to-day administration and law enforcement were managed by a sheriff, a far more powerful figure than today. As the chief law enforcement officer, the sheriff was responsible for, firstly, maintaining order by raising a hue and cry to pursue felons, making arrests, and managing the civil jail. If a crime such as shoplifting was witnessed, the victim or witness was legally obligated to raise a loud cry to alert the entire community. Upon hearing the cry, every able-bodied man in the village was required by law to stop what he was doing, arm himself with whatever weapon he could find, and join in the pursuit of the suspect, which was accompanied by ringing of church bells and, most importantly, blowing horns. The goal was to capture the culprit as fast as possible through a collective mob-like effort. Failure to join the hue and cry could result in a fine. Secondly, holding a monthly court for civil and minor criminal cases. Thirdly, twice a year to travel a circuit of all the liberties districts, known as baronies in Ireland. To hold court, hear reports of crimes, settle disputes, and inspect the Frank Pledge groups, which were formal self-policing groups similar to modern-day neighbourhood watches, with additional powers of enforcement and collecting fines mandated by the local court. Fourthly, executing the legal orders of the courts, which often entailed acting on or refusing writs from Dublin's royal courts. Fifthly, raising and leading the local militia for defence. And sixthly, collecting taxes, debts and fines that were owed the liberty. The sheriff was assisted by under-sheriffs, who were often lawyers acting as his legal advisers, and bailiffs, who were his on-the-beat enforcement officers. While in native Irish culture, witches were usually herbalist healers, or wise people known as farfashas, banfashas, or fairy doctors, who were often held in high esteem in the community. Norman seneschals were usually only interested in these wise men or women if they were accused of doing harm to people or property. Sometimes, however, they became a nuisance when they triggered local, often violent feuds, after blaming random neighbours for being the cause of someone else's illness or of someone's milk cow drying up. In Hiberno-Norman Ireland, witches were supposed to be tried under common law, but were almost always acquitted for lack of hard evidence. Ecclesiastical law, or canon law, which was very different from English common law, was expected to rule on matters crucial to maintaining the orthodox faith and the moral order of Christian society, was enforced in Kilkenny by the Bishop of Ossory, whose seat was at St. Canice's Cathedral. Its primary function was to enforce church dogma and punish heretical belief, apostasy, and preachers promoting schisms. The broader legal framework for this authority was systematized by Pope Boniface VIII in his Liber Sextus of 1298, which became a foundational text for 14th century canon law. A pivotal decree within this works mandated that secular powers assist the Church in prosecuting heretics. This decretal formalized the episcopal Inquisition by shifting the legal process to an inquisitorial model, where a judge could initiate an investigation ex officio. It sanctioned the use of secret testimony and allowed the identities of accusers to be withheld from the accused. It also permitted testimony from otherwise unreliable or infamous witnesses, severely restricting the accused's right to a legal defense, and endorsed the Church heavily stacking the proceedings against a defendant. The Church's hierarchy placed the Pope at its apex, with ultimate authority over doctrine, appointments, and canon law. Below him, Ireland was divided into 4 ecclesiastical districts called provinces, each of which was governed by a metropolitan or archbishop. The Bishop of Ossory was a suffragan under his metropolitan, the Archbishop of Dublin. Unlike English common law, canon law applied to everyone equally, regardless of race or professed religion. At this time, the Church in Ireland had a very good working relationship with the judicial system, with many clerics simultaneously filling important secular and ecclesiastical positions. The campaign against magic and heresy intensified significantly during the pontificate of Pope John XXII. Driven by a personal paranoia that rivals were attempting to poison him through dark magic, he began aggressively pursuing sorcerers and necromancers, even among his court in Avignon. He believed himself to be surrounded by enemies who were ever making attempts on his life, by modelling images of him in wax, to be subsequently thrust through with pins before melting down. In a landmark 1320 public letter, he framed sorcery as a secret heresy, clearly placing it within the jurisdiction of the Church. He accused witches of making a pact with hell, declaring witchcraft an exceptional crime so heinous that it justified suspending the legal protections of the accused. This top-down endorsement of ecclesiastical Inquisition methodology legitimized and even encouraged the newly appointed Richard de Ledrede, Bishop of Ossory, who was an enormous admirer of the Pope. He had spent a lot of time with Pope John XXII in Avignon, who had subsequently promoted him to the bishopric, and left determined to vigorously stamp out witchcraft he believed had become rampant in the church. In the mid-13th century, a merchant named Robert le Kyteler was among the early Flemish families who settled in a district of Kilkenny called Flemingstown, where he began to conduct trade with his homeland. Though Flemish people sometimes faced underlying resentment, they easily integrated into Norman society and could freely conduct business and intermarry with the Norman nobility. José de Kyteler, possibly Robert's son, was one such individual of good standing, who amassed a small fortune as a merchant during his years in Kilkenny. José's status as a leading civis placed his only daughter, Dame Alice, at the top of Kilkenny's urban elite from her birth. That his late 13th century tombstone, inscribed with Lombardic script in both Latin and Norman French, was placed in St. Mary's in a location that was reserved for the elites is testament to his high status. Around 1280, Dame Alice Kyteler married her first husband, William Outlawe, a wealthy, well-connected Kilkenny merchant and moneylender whose family held prominent positions in Dublin. Thus, by marriage, Alice became closely related to Roger Outlaw, the Chancellor of Ireland, and a close ally of the powerful Butler family. Her husband died in 1285, leaving their only son, William Outlaw the Younger, to inherit and greatly expand their family banking fortunes. At one point, he even became the mayor of Kilkenny. She may also have had a daughter named Rose, of whom little is known. Upon her father's death in the late 1280s, Alice inherited José's entire fortune, which, when added to William's money, made them exceedingly rich. By 1302, Alice had married her second husband, Adam Blund of Callan. Adam was an even richer banker and moneylender who had several children from a previous marriage. Shortly after their marriage, Alice and Adam were accused of murdering Alice's close relative, William le Kyteler, and one other who allegedly had stolen £3,000 from Alice at a time when a craftsman only earned £5 per year. This staggering sum would have an equivalent value today of between 20 and 40 million pounds or more. The matter was eventually resolved in Alice's favour, thanks to the personal intervention of Edward Longshanks, King of England. Despite her royal endorsement, the incident fostered lasting suspicions and resentment toward Alice within the Kyteler family, and some in the broader community. After Adam's premature death in about 1309, Alice married her third husband, Richard de Val, a major Tipperary landholder. Following his sudden death around 1316, Kyteler took legal action against one of her stepsons, Richard de Val the Younger, to recover her widow's dower. This move angered her stepchildren, who otherwise stood to inherit that wealth, and fueled the glowing embers of the existing underlying resentments within the community. In 1324, she married her fourth husband, Sir John le Power, a relative of Sir Arnold le Power, the seneschal of the Liberty of Leinster. Sir Arnold was also the uncle of Sir Roger Outlaw, the Lord Chancellor of Ireland and prior of the powerful Knights Hospitaller Preceptory in Kilmainham, near Dublin. Another formidable relative of Sir Arnold was Stephen le Power, the Bishop of Cork and Cloyne. Other influential members of that power clique included Mela le Power, the Bishop of Leighlin, and a wealthy, well-connected cleric named Robert de Bristol from Kilkenny. Through her marriage to John le Power, Alice had become linked into some of the most powerful, interconnected Hiberno-Norman ruling families who held enormous influence in both the secular and ecclesiastical worlds. As Alice's standing and wealth steadily grew, fueled by her money-lending business, added to by the fortunes of her deceased husbands, so did local resentment. Rumours spread that she was killing off her wealthy husbands to increase her personal net worth. Then, as we previously saw, on August the 5th, 1316, Pope John XXII, shortly after his election as pontiff, appointed the excessively rich and well-connected Richard de Ledrede as Bishop of Ossory and changed history. This stranger in a strange land, a witchcraft-obsessed former English Franciscan friar who had been an intimate of King Edward II, arrived in Kilkenny and set about turning Ireland upside down by accusing numerous nobles and leading churchmen of unimaginable crimes. The early years of the bishop's tenure was a tumultuous period in Irish history. Following King Edward II's disastrous defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, and the subsequent Scottish raid on Yorkshire, led by Edward Bruce in 1322, Edward II's ineptitude in everything he did, and the dispenser's show of cowardice in fleeing the battlefield, abandoning the king's treasure to the Scots, caused widespread financial and political instability in England. It was also a time when England's relationship with the Flemish had grown strained, if not hostile, because of their cooperation with the Scots under the Auld Alliance. Ledrede, the loyal Englishman and supporter of Edward II's cause, was a zealot for church orthodoxy and establishing papal authority over the Irish Church. Ever since the Synod of Kells in 1152, when the Celtic Church had become fully integrated into the Roman diocesan structure, certain cultural and administrative practices with roots in the older Celtic monastic traditions of the early Irish saints still persisted. Our English bishop immediately began trying to enforce papal decrees and canon law in his diocese, often in ways that directly challenged the local secular and clerical powers. Ledrede had convinced himself Kilkenny was a hotbed of heresy and began provoking the establishment, who were not afraid to strike back. He claimed to have received information from secret informants that in the town of Kilkenny there had long been and still were many heretics and sorcerers who used divers kinds of magic, and he was determined to find them. The atmosphere in his diocese had become so hostile, Ledrede bypassed his metropolitan and appealed directly to the Pope for support, who in turn wrote to the Justiciar of Ireland, Edmund Butler, accusing the Justiciar of harassing and imprisoning his bishop. This letter from Pope John XXII, dated August in 1320, is evidence of a major political clash, and revealed Bishop Ledrede had made powerful enemies within Anglo Irish society almost immediately upon his arrival. Since there is no record of Ledrede ever having been imprisoned before 1320, it appears to have been another example of Ledrede's embellishment of the facts, for which he became well known. The stage was now set for further intensive conflicts that would erupt during the Kilkenny witchcraft trial, where charges of heresy and threats of excommunication to anyone who opposed the bishop were weaponized in this epic battle between church and state. After Alice's fourth husband, John le Power, became unwell in 1324, rumours began to resurface that Alice was poisoning her husbands for their money. When these tales reached the ear of Bishop Richard de Ledrede, He immediately began investigating and soon was able to enlist formal accusations against Alice Kyteler from her estranged stepson, Richard de Ledrede. He asserted Alice had a history of using magical concoctions to enchant her husbands into handing over their wealth to her and her son before killing them. This was sufficient evidence for Ledrede to initiate his famous Inquisition, applying the template recently provided by the Pope. He twisted the complaint into an elaborate satanic conspiracy, meticulously crafted to fall under the authority of the Church for heresy rather than a secular one of witchcraft. It was designed to incite the maximum possible public outrage, and in doing so made Ireland one of the first places where witches were prosecuted for a capital offence. Charges were initiated in Norman French, Latin and Middle English, similar to Chaucer's English, against Alice, her son William Outlawe, and two of Alice's accomplices, Petronilla of Meath or Midia, and Petronilla's daughter Sarah, who some historians called Basilia, with the practice of witchcraft, enchantment, sorceries, and heresy. Bishop Ledrede immediately wrote to William's uncle, Roger Outlawe, who was the Chancellor of Ireland and the King's chief legal officer. To apply for a writ to arrest the accused, he called pestiferous persons. In his letter, he accused William Outlawe of making to himself friends of the mammon of unrighteousness. Roger was not only the Chancellor, but also being the Prior of St. John of Jerusalem, was an important churchman who Ledrede expected to fully comply with his Pope-approved directives. When Ledrede failed to obtain a writ of arrest from the Lord Chancellor, the bishop turned to Sir Arnold le Power, the seneschal of Kilkenny, a nephew of Roger Outlawe, who tried in vain to persuade the bishop to drop the charges. As a technicality of law, Sir Arnold pointed out, the writ could not be issued until the accused had been excommunicated for at least 40 days. Bishop Ledrede then cited Alice to appear before his ecclesiastical court, whereupon, using the benefit of the 40-day reprieve, she escaped out of his diocese to Dublin, where she had many relatives and friends in high places. In her place, her former brother-in-law, Roger Outlawe, had clerical advocates defend her charges, insisting it was unnecessary for Alice to appear in person. By the time of the hearing, Alice and her circle had been declared excommunicated for more than 40 days, but Alice and Sarah both remained out of the grasp of the bishop. Unable to catch them, Ledrede turned his attention to Alice's son, William Outlawe, who fled to the Priory of Kells, which was located just 9 miles south of Kilkenny. It is important to distinguish the County Kilkenny Kells from the two other better-known monastic foundations, also named Kells, in County Meath and County Antrim. He had gone with the help of Arnold le Power, who was also Lord of the Barony of Kells. Although the priory was firmly within Ledrede's authority, it was a house of the canons regular of St. Augustine, who resented the English bishop's endless interferences. William found support from the Prior of Kells, who happened to be one of the most powerful lords spiritual of the Irish Parliament. As a direct affront to Bishop Ledrede, William was given sanctuary within the priory's grounds, showcasing the intense political and religious divisions Ledrede had stirred up within the Irish Church. When Bishop Ledrede visited Kells, Arnold le Power began urging His Excellency until almost midnight to withdraw his intended action. Realizing his pleas were falling on deaf ears, Arnold angrily left, pouring out abuses and threats against the bishop as he stormed out. The secular authorities of Arnold le Power and Roger Outlawe were furious at the bishop for excommunicating their kin and completely disrupting the social order of their liberty. They wanted to retaliate in a way that was legally justifiable, but would be the most humiliating for the bishop. They accused the Most Reverend Richard de Ledrede of the crime of violating praemunire for enforcing an unauthorized papal bull over royal authority, making him a felon in the eyes of the secular court. From the late 13th and early 14th centuries, kings and parliaments had been enacting provisions and using common law procedures to limit papal interferences that threatened royal jurisdiction. These provisions were soon after codified into the 1353 Statute of Praemunire. By declaring him a criminal, they were justifying initiating a hue and cry against him. The following day, Arnold sent a bailiff named Stephen le Power, who was a member of a junior branch of Arnold's family, with a posse of armed men to deliver a writ to arrest Bishop Ledrede and to confiscate all his personal goods and chattels. In reply, the bishop made a most eloquent oratory in which he refused to submit to the bailiff, but quickly changed his mind when the bailiff threatened him with a hue and cry. The sight of a bishop, who held the rank of a prince of the church, having a mob of common peasants and townsfolk chasing him through the muddy streets and across the countryside like a common thief or rapist, with yelling, blowing horns and brandishing pitchforks, would utterly destroy his carefully cultivated aura of pious dignity he had tried so hard to project. Ledrede was then arrested and incarcerated for 17 days in Kilkenny town jail in the Tolsule building located near the castle at the south end of town, where he was allowed one priest as a companion, one male servant to make his bed, and one lad to prepare his dinner. During his imprisonment, the outraged Bishop Ledrede angrily took the extreme measure of putting his entire diocese under an interdict, which prohibited everyone except for himself and his intimate companions from celebrating Mass, getting married, being confirmed, receiving their last rites, or having a Christian burial. This, the bishop knew, would put the entire diocese into the chaos of a spiritual crisis, and was designed to turn the horrified public against the accused and their supporters. Holding the host up for everyone to see, he proclaimed the body of Christ was also imprisoned with him. Next, the captive bishop, using his carte blanche powers granted him by the Pope, excommunicated Arnold and Stephen le Power, along with all their known supporters, while the bishop's popularity as a perceived persecuted holy man grew daily. He was like Peter in jail, waiting to be released by the angel of the Lord. Meanwhile, as he anticipated his miracle, clergy and dignitaries flocked to the jail from far and wide, while an itinerant Dominican monk preached to the crowd outside on the words of Jesus. "Blessed are they which are persecuted," driving the listeners into a frenzy. This was a battle in which the souls of the community were gravely at risk. Loved ones were in jeopardy of dying in their sins, without confession, and without the benefit of last rites, and of remaining unburied. On the day the bishop was to appear before the king's court, 2 justices of the king's bench sat to hear the case against Ledrede. The jury, who may have been swayed by the bishop's threats of excommunicating them, unsurprisingly found the saintly churchman not guilty on each of the many charges brought against him. William Outlawe, now in a panic, resurrected an old accusation against the bishop, which had been dropped when it was deemed to have been a matter of ecclesiastical concern. William reworked the charges and subsequently submitted the fraudulently altered document, which he had artificially aged, as new evidence. Forging documents was apparently not uncommon at the time, as many such counterfeit legal documents have recently been discovered in old libraries. The revamped charges were instantly dismissed after the bishop again announced everyone who supported them would be excommunicated ipso facto, which meant they would be automatically excommunicated without a trial. Suddenly, for many, the fight was not worth forfeiting their afterlife. So on the 18th day of Ledrede's imprisonment, Arnold released the persecuted saint. The vindicated prelate emerged from his confinement dressed in his full bishop's regalia, and with prodigious pomp and ceremony, he stated, "It will not do for a bishop imprisoned for his faith in Christ to walk out of this prison as if he were a thief or murderer." Followed by a great multitude, the bishop ceremoniously made his way through the streets all the way to the cathedral to give thanks to God. Meanwhile, the King's Bench in Dublin had issued a writ for Ledrede to appear before them to show cause why he had placed his entire diocese under an interdict and to answer the charges laid against him by Arnold le Power. He was simultaneously cited by his ecclesiastical superior, William de Ledrede, the Dean of the Metropolitan Church, acting on behalf of the Archbishop of Dublin, who was away, to explain why his diocese was in such a disarray. But Ledrede, showing little respect for his dean, refused to appear, claiming it was far too dangerous for him to travel through what he maintained was the hostile territory of his enemies, and sent a proctor in his stead. On hearing the case, the dean found against the bishop and reversed the interdict. After that, the King's Bench appears to have dropped their case. While the seneschal in Kilkenny was holding his regularly scheduled court in Kilkenny, Ledrede appeared unannounced to address the nobles and parochials present. When Arnold refused to allow this interruption, the bishop reappeared, fully robed, and carrying the sacrament in a golden vase, claiming to be elevating the body of Christ. With much fanfare, he made his way towards the bench, pushing past some nobles who had tried to block him, followed by his entire cathedral chapter in train. Annoyed at this impertinent disruption and show of disrespect, Arnold angrily jumped down from the bench and, with a string of harsh and abusive words, expelled the bishop from his courthouse et turpiter ejesi. After the subsequent uproar calmed down, Arnold, listening to calmer minds, relented to allowing the bishop, whom he described as a vile, rustic, vagabond friar from England, to address the court from the place where convicted criminals stand for sentencing. Ledrede, protesting loudly against his ignominious treatment and likening himself to Christ standing before Pontius Pilate, he pressed the court to arrest Alice and her son. Unmoved by the bishop's magniloquence, Arnold suggested the bishop should perhaps look for satisfaction from a different court and restrict his sermons to Sunday church. Soon after, Bishop Ledrede received a citation from the Archbishop of Dublin to answer charges he had illegally excommunicated Alice without her being convicted of a crime. Again, the bishop appeared by an attorney who presented the court with a written brief affirming the bishop had already convicted Alice of heresy in absentia, for which she had supposedly repented. But now the bishop wished to proceed with the new charge of relapsing, despite her freely associating with many clerics and regularly attending church in Dublin. Once more, the bishop failed to make his case before the Metropolitan Court, causing the bishop to be encumbered with what he described as much trouble and expense. Shortly after Alice's acquittal in Dublin, Sir Arnold le Power cited the bishop before the House of Lords in Dublin. This time the bishop, convinced he would find more support there, appeared in person before the great assembly of aristocrats, where Arnold accused the English churchman of being a vagabond from England, who was acting upon a papal bull that had not been enjoined on us by the king's seal. Arnold described the bishop using a well-known contemporary pejorative for a monk who had left his own monastery to wander about the countryside as an interloper. Furthermore, he was accused of being a foreigner that misunderstood the Irish and thought them all heretics, despite Ireland being well known as a land of saints and being without apostates. Ledrede was alleged to have indiscriminately used the threat of excommunication against his opponents. In Arnold's opinion, the bishop, in making his broad, sweeping accusations, had libelled and besmirched every Irishman. After this, the proceedings became so heated, they devolved into a shouting match of lost tempers. At this point, Parliament decided it would be more convenient to wash their hands of the affair and defer the matter to an ecclesiastical commission made up of 4 bishops, headed by the Dean of St. Patrick's. Upon hearing Ledrede's pitiful retelling of the details of his horrifying captivity in the Tolsoul in Kilkenny, the Dean reprimanded Arnold and suggested he apologise to the bishop, who with great humility forgave Sir Arnold in front of all the eminent churchmen and nobles present. From here, things went rapidly downhill for Arnold, and the commission eventually decided for the bishop, who was now free to proceed without hindrance against the troublesome heretics in his diocese. At Ledrede's request, the Dean cited Alice to appear before the Bishop Ledrede in Kilkenny to answer charges of being a relapsed heretic. While he remained in Dublin to celebrate his victory with his supporters, Bishop Ledrede sent orders to the Kilkenny authorities to arrest all the accused and hold them in jail until his return. But the sheriff only arrested Alice's less wealthy associates that were still around, who by now included John Galrusin, Ellen Galrusin, Sissock Galrusin, William Payne de Boley, Petronilla of Meath, Alice the wife of Henry Faber, Anota Lang, and Eva de Brownstown. Robert of Bristol, an accused minor cleric, left the diocese to find sanctuary with the Bishop of Cork. Upon hearing this, Ledrede straightway made his way back to Kilkenny, claiming to have narrowly missed an ambush that had laid in wait for him along the way, and lost no time to enter the jail to interrogate his quarry. Using his powers outlined in the 1298 Ut Inquisitiones, Bishop Ledrede started the formal proceedings of an episcopal inquisition, with the lead prosecutor being himself. In doing so, he was careful to follow the standard inquisitorial process, which allowed for the inclusion of public rumour and suspicion, secret testimony, and torture. Since under canon law, a confession was viewed as the queen of all proofs, any method was justifiable to extract one from a suspected sorcerer. Very soon Ledrede prompted full confessions from many of the prisoners, and proudly announced he had confessions for more crimes than he had originally suspected, and the prisoners had agreed Dame Alice Kyteler was the mother and mistress of all the iniquity. Torture was a great truth serum in the hands of Bishop Ledrede that gave him all the evidence he needed to proceed against the elites. He wrote to the Bishop of Athy to arrest Alice, William, Sarah, and other persons he had named as accomplices, who were now residing outside his jurisdiction. The Bishop of Athy did not act on Ledrede's writ because he said he found it without precedent and unintelligible. Ledrede again cited William to appear to answer the accusations against him. Although William turned up, the bishop instead began laying out all the charges against his mother, and promptly pronounced Alice guilty of being a sorceress, a magician, a heretic, and a relapsed one. He ordered her to be taken into custody and all her goods forfeited. After this, the bishop went out and publicly burned a sackload of abominations the bishop suspected Alice had used to perform her unchristian acts. Dame Alice bolted from the bishop's clutches a second time. This time she left Dublin, possibly taking Sarah with her, and crossed the Irish Sea to England or Flanders, where she remained completely out of sight, never again to return to her homeland in Ireland. The following day, the bishop issued another writ against William to appear before him in St. Mary's Church. This time William turned up with a band of armed men, and the bishop summarily pronounced him guilty of heresy, of favouring, receiving, and defending heretics, as well as of usury, perjury, adultery, and clericide. The charge of clericide, meaning the murder of a cleric, was another of Ledrede's embellishments, referring to William beating up the bishop's messenger who had delivered the writ to a peer. After confessing on bended knees to some of his non-heretical offences, for which he had been found guilty, the bishop ordered William to prison until he should decide his fate. Striking a cleric in public view, like incest, murder, and sodomy, was listed under canon law as a sin so serious that only the Pope could grant absolution. John Darcy, the justiciar, Roger Outlaw, the chancellor, and Walter de Islep, the treasurer, who was later charged with embezzling over £1,332 from the Liberty, all appealed to Ledrede for mercy for William. In view of the high stations of these interceders, Ledrede commuted his planned sentence to hearing 3 masses daily for 3 years, feeding a certain number of the poor, and paying to have both the cathedral and St. Mary's church roofs covered with lead. This would have been an astronomically high cost. Comparing it to the cost of covering part of York Minster in 1365, the likely cost for both the cathedral and St. Mary's would have been around £700, equating to between £5 and £10 million today. After spending a further 9 weeks in strict durance, William was allowed to go free. Either Ledrede had dropped the charge of clericide, or William had beaten the cleric out of public view, whereupon the bishop was able to give release for his clericide. However, upon noticing William was not performing his penance to the bishop's satisfaction, he quickly ordered William to be returned to jail. On the same day, Ledrede took Alice's handmaid, Petronilla, whom he had personally punished and chastised through 6 parishes to secure her confession, and dispatched her without offering her the customary option of repentance and reformation. In this way, on the 3rd of November 1324, Petronilla went down in history as the first witch to die in an auto de fe in Ireland, and her case became the template for many others that were to follow in Ireland and the rest of the Catholic world for centuries to come. The Franciscan chronicler John Glynn wrote, "Petronilla de Media was condemned for sorcery, lot-taking, and offering sacrifices to demons, and consigned to the flames and burned. Moreover, before her, even in olden days, it was neither seen nor heard of that anyone suffered the death penalty for heresy in Ireland." Her confession followed the standard format that perfectly confirmed the paranoia of the Pope and his lackey, Bishop Ledrede. Petronilla confessed to Alice and her group, having nightly conference with an Ethiopian spirit she called Robert or Robin Artisan, to whom they sacrificed at a certain crossroads 9 red cockerels and 9 peacocks' eyes or eggs. She said Robin, whom Ledrede later described as a man of low stature and dark complexion, would sometimes be accompanied by 2 larger, darker, and taller companions, one of whom carried an iron rod. She also confirmed the rumour true that Alice swept the streets of Kilkenny nightly between the hours of the final church service and twilight, brushing all the manure from the streets towards the door of her son William Outlawe, while silently murmuring the enchanting words, "To the house of William my son I sweep all the wealth of Kilkenny town." At the time of the Crusades, an Ethiopian was sometimes a euphemism for a member of a semi-mythical group of jinns who were famous among the inhabitants of Western Arabia for their nocturnal escapades. As it is unlikely Alice's servant would have known anything about this obscure people, her confession likely tells us more about Ledrede's own fantasies than they do of Petronilla's. Petronilla had confessed that Alice and her circle had denied the Christian faith entirely for a year and a day. She admitted to stealing the keys of the church and holding rituals there at night, cutting up living roosters and cats, and offering them to the demon, Robin, meant as a deliberate perversion of the Christian sacrament. Alice's companions also confessed to Alice using these rituals to gain knowledge, wealth, and power over her husbands and the community, and of creating potions, powders, and charms using blasphemous ingredients, including the hair, nails, and internal organs of the dead animals they sacrificed, the brains of an unbaptized child, the robes of a Catholic priest, and the skull of a criminal to gain wealth, power, and love. Petronilla also admitted to specific and salacious charges against Alice that Robin Artisan, accusing them of being lovers. She admitted to seeing Alice committing shameful acts with Robin, including unnatural kissing, making Alice the first woman to ever be formally accused of having acquired her extraordinary powers through relations with a demon. Upon subsequently searching Dame Alice's house, Ledrede claimed to have found a wafer of sacramental bread, with a devil's name inscribed on it in the place of Jesus, and a length of pipe, or a wooden staff, which had been greased with ointment, on her nightstand. Petronilla confessed they had used the wafer for satanic rituals, and Alice used the short staff for ambling and galloping through thick and thin while her husband slept. Upon hearing of Petronilla's fate, William tore his clothes and threw himself prostrate in the dust in front of the prelate, begging for forgiveness for the way he had so poorly mistreated the virtuous bishop and his messenger. After a humiliating dressing down in which Ledrede again reviewed a lengthy list of William's shortcomings, he pronounced that, although he had already forgiven William for his offences against his person, he was unable to reverse the excommunication at that time. The terms for William's release from prison this time were he must immediately set out on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, fund a perpetual chantry, which was an endowment to pay for one or more priests to pray for the soul of the benefactor, and reinforce the church's roofs with even more lead than he already agreed. This last stipulation had an unforeseen consequence in 1332, when the cathedral roof collapsed from being overloaded. As for the other pestiferous heretics, they received a variety of penalties, including the ultimate one: brandings, corporal punishments, fines, and banishments. Some, like Alice, escaped from Ledrede's influence altogether by going to England or Flanders, while Ledrede continued to root out and burn other heretics for several more years. In this way, Ledrede said that most foul brood was scattered and destroyed. William went on to have 3 children named William Outlawe, Arnold Outlaw, and Margaret Outlaw, who married Maurice Fitzwilliam. Then in 1328, the Bishop Richard de Ledrede's paranoia returned. Not satisfied with having expunged all remnants of Alice's sorcery coven, he directed his attention towards his old enemy and opponent of Edward II, Sir Arnold le Power, by accusing him of heresy and of protecting a witch. After excommunicating Sir Arnold, the seneschal was arrested and thrown into Dublin Castle to await a trial. Roger Outlaw, the former Chancellor, who had by this time been promoted to Lord Deputy of Ireland, came to Arnold's aid and gave orders he be treated well in prison. Since Roger was also the prior of the prestigious Knights Hospitaller Priory of St. John of Jerusalem at Kilmainham, 2 miles from Dublin, he spoke with considerable church authority in proclaiming the charges against Arnold were false. This challenge to his perceived supremacy enraged the bishop, who promptly excommunicated Roger as well, accusing him of providing Arnold with his advice and counsel, Fortunately for the prior, he was quickly vindicated and cleared of all charges by a select committee of peers, bishops, abbots, and priors. Sir Arnold le Power, on the other hand, mysteriously died, an impenitent excommunicate in prison before he had his hearing, effectively ending his family's hereditary right, since he died while under the ban of excommunication and was subject to the eternal punishment of hell. His body suffered the indignity of lying unburied for a long time until he could be interred in unhallowed ground. Following Arnold's premature death under these extraordinary circumstances, the Crown escheated or seized the liberty until it was granted to James Butler, the first Earl of Ormond, in 1345. During the interim, the liberty was governed directly by the Justiciar of Ireland, Roger Outlawe, and the Irish Exchequer, John de Redness, through the royal courts in Dublin. The devout bishop, not content with having caused chaos in his own diocese of Ossory, turned his attention to doing the same in Dublin and England. Shortly after Roger Outlawe was vindicated, Ledrede's metropolitan, Alexander de Bicknor, accused him of heresy. Fleeing to Avignon in 1329, the disgraced bishop appealed in person before his friend the Pope. In response, King Edward III wrote to the Pope, warning him not to give an ear to Bishop Ledrede, who had run away from the charges when he ought to have remained in Ireland to answer his demerits. The king in another letter explained to the Pope that Ledrede had run away because he was aware he was guilty. Ledrede's propensity for conflict continued throughout the rest of his life, leading to his temporalities being confiscated and returned on several occasions. On one such occasion, Roger Mortimer, 1st Earl of March, accused him of treason for allegedly plotting to free the captive Edward II. As a result, his land was seized in the name of the young king, Edward III. Undeterred, Ledrede travelled to England and mounted a successful defence before the King's Council. Despite claiming to have endured many troubles along the way, he achieved his goal, and his temporalities were restored by 1332. Never ceasing in his efforts, Bishop Ledrede stubbornly continued his hunt for alleged witches and heretics, resorting to public burnings from time to time. His reputation in such matters eventually led to his involvement in England, where he was called upon to advise local clerics on suppressing heresy. While history is silent on Bishop Ledrede's full motives, his loyalty to the unpopular Edward II offers a clue. He likely supported the king's despised favourites, the Despensers, who were fierce opponents of the Le Power family. Since Hugh Despenser the Younger held a claim to the lordship of Leinster, Ledrede may have viewed the secular administrators such as Sir Arnold le Power and Sir Roger Outlawe, who were most likely appointed by the Butler family, as unlawful usurpers. Thus, beyond mere revenge, Ledrede might have genuinely believed he was prosecuting traitors against the Despenser claim. A further undercurrent was the political friction between Ledrede and his superior, Archbishop Alexander de Bicknor. Bicknor had his own checkered history, which was also fraught with treason and rebellion. A nobleman by birth, he had been appointed by King Edward II for a mission to France. There he allegedly met Queen Isabella, and the exiled Roger Mortimer deserted his post and joined their rebel faction. An enraged Edward II declared him a traitor, seized his assets, and attempted to have him deposed as archbishop. However, protected by papal support, Bicknor ultimately returned in triumph to Dublin after Edward's own deposition. Old resentments lingered, and the dispute between Ledrede and Archbishop Bicknor didn't improve upon the archbishop's return. Their relationship had become so difficult that by 1341, Ledrede sent a remarkable petition to King Edward III, mirroring the Pope's old paranoia, claiming his primate had planned to murder him. But Ledrede had also managed to make himself a persistent thorn in the side of the crown. The young king was now personally very familiar with his name, as reports constantly arrived of new outrages involving the controversial holy man, either as the perpetrator or the victim. In 1360, the long and contentious career of Bishop Ledrede concluded with his death at an advanced age. He was laid to rest in St. Canice's Cathedral, beside the high altar. Throughout his 42 years as bishop, he had been a perennial source of strife, earning him more adversaries than friends. He is believed to have inspired the words of a popular anonymous poem. There once were 2 cats of Kilkenny. Each thought there was 1 cat too many, so they fought and they fit, and they scratched and they bit till, excepting their nails and the tips of their tails. Instead of 2 cats, there weren't any. If you liked this video and would like to see more, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel.